think this has been a hot topic, but sorry, Reba, but everyone's kind of coming at it with their own perspective or from their own lens. I think that this isn't really gonna be a talk per se, but more just a space for people who come at it from different perspectives to voice that and actually interact with one another. But I do want to ground it in like some basis of we have some data that we can work with, we have some models that we can rely upon, and we have some core principles that hopefully we can agree on, and then go with that discussion from there when it comes to Filecoin Plus. So this is the base assumption that Filecoin is like a decentralized data storage network. If that assumption is something to contest, it would be great for someone to raise their hand now, because if we can agree upon this, then I can skip this. I don't have to talk over this slide, and then we can go after that. So speak now or forever hold your peace, because this is the assumption that the rest of the talk or discussion kind of falls under. Okay, cool. That sounds like no one raised their hand. So great. So then, if that's the case, why do we have protocol incentives? Protocol incentives exist to align the behaviors of participants towards and push them towards a direction of what we want to see in the network, like what we want, what kind of behaviors we want in the network. And in this case, what we want is a decentralized storage network. What we want is a bunch of storage providers who offer up their hardware and compute resources to build a network in which we can credibly challenge and subsume the current iteration of the cloud. That's a really ambitious vision, and that is something we all agreed upon just now, that that's what we want, right? So if that's the case, I'm not saying incentives are not the only thing that will help achieve that. If anything, there's a huge amount of engineering work. There's an entire workshop week in this city and then also in Iceland that's about making that a technical possibility. But the part I'll say is that the incentives should at least exist to make sure that if all that tech exists, if all of that work has been done, the rational behaviors for participants is to push them to realize that vision for the Filecoin network, right? So there are a number of ways to quantitatively or mathematically assess that, but one is to say generally it should be preferable to store data on the network rather than just committing capacity. This isn't to say that committing capacity should not happen on the network, because if you're a storage provider, one interesting thing is the fact that you don't need to build out a whole all the parts necessary to store data if you want to start immediately earning. If you want to start immediately earning with the Filecoin network, you can do so just by committing capacity. But we do want a network where eventually, once you've figured out how to do the whole sealing process and you've figured out how to commit capacity, you realize, hey, it's actually better for me if I start filling that space that I've just committed to the network with deals. So committing capacity is still valuable, but we do want a network where it's preferable to actually engage with clients and be a storage provider. So that's the kind of overarching tenet of what we'll talk about further, which is just that the profit for a deal should be larger than the profit for committing capacity. But there's also one more thing, which is that it is more expensive to store data. It is easier, and it is easier to just commit capacity to the network because the reason why is just that if you're going to be a storage provider who stores data, you need to do everything that someone who is just committing capacity does, plus more. So that means that the revenues and costs for storage providers depend based on what kind of profile, what kind of actions they decide to take. So it's pretty easy if you're just committing capacity to understand where your revenues and costs comes from. If you're just committing capacity, your revenues come from block rewards, and your costs are just whatever the capital and operational expenditures it takes to maintain that operation. Now, the great thing is if you're storing deals from clients, you also have the potential to charge for that service because you're offering up your hardware that is now valuable to someone else because it's storing their data. So you can have storage revenues, And then you might get more block rewards for doing so if there's a storage incentive on the network. So that little M term there is just a quality multiplier that exists for storing data. That doesn't have to exist, but I think we're going to talk about why it needs to exist, at least like now, in order for us to make sure that the profit for storing a deal is greater than the profit for just committing capacity. So the summary, which says it much more succinctly than I just did, is that if you want to have storing deals be attractive, you need to either be able to charge sufficient fees, which is storage revenues, or there needs to be a sufficient block reward allocation to deal sectors, or some combination of the two. So this is nicer. So this is like just the visual representation of what I just kind of talked about, right? So it's taking this statement and saying, what is the minimum quality multiplier needed on the network for storing data that will make it more preferable to store data rather than just committing capacity? I don't know, I guess this is kind of hard to see in the back, but I can kind of talk over it. Sorry, guys. Okay, that's fine too. So the bottom, the x-axis is just the exchange rate. It's the Phil USD exchange rate, and y is the quality multiplier. So in lower exchange rate regimes, which is one we're in now, you kind of need a higher quality multiplier to make it more preferable to store data. And that changes as you change the exchange rate regime. The intuition why this is true, though, is there is a certain amount of capital and OpEx costs needed to be a storage provider that's just denominated in fiat. And so when you are in a lower exchange rate regime, you need a larger block reward differential between committed capacity and storing data in order to make it more preferable to store deals. Now, when you're in a higher exchange rate regime, you don't need that to be the case because all the quality multiplier is saying is just like how much more do you get from the network for storing data. And so when that exchange rate is high, the CapEx and OpEx differential between storing data and committing capacity remains the same. But because the exchange rate is higher, you need less of a block reward difference to cover that. So that's all that's really saying here. Yeah.
But if the exchange rate is high,
Mm-hmm.
and you're saying there's not much of an M you need, you don't need a big differential.
Yeah, exactly.
What is the incentive to store data then? I'm sorry, is it like the payment from the client? Like I do that. Like why would I then not just commit capacity if the differential is less anyways at high exchange rates?
You still end up earning more, I guess.
Yeah, because this line is maintaining this statement. The sector profit for deals is greater than the sector profit for CC. So the idea is like, yeah, sure, you will earn for committing capacity. The idea is we always want it to be the case where you should earn more for storing deals, right? Okay.
Is that chart, like, can you also say that chart is the operational overhead for actually running a data storing operation, a data storage operation?
Yeah, it's the sector cost.
Exactly. It's like the operational overhead, right? The infrastructural overhead.
It's like a minimum
The cost.
to compensate
It's
For running the infrastructure and running the operations.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yes.
Like both CC and deals have some amount, but there's a difference, and then what is the M that addresses that difference? Now, this thing shifts like based on how much you can charge for storage, right? Like if you're able to charge a lot for storage, then you may not need any minimum multiplier at all. If you want to play with this, actually, Kieran has made a really, really cool calculator where this kind of comes out. So take this QR code, and it will point you to that. I can give you guys a second if you need.
Meanwhile, what are the different colors of the what's
So like this is like we have some. The one is like we have some cost estimate of how much it is to like store data or commit capacity. This is like if that cost estimate was slightly like 20% lower or a little bit higher or 20% higher or something like that, right? It's just giving you some way to play around with some ranges. Okay, so that's the one part of Filecoin Plus, right? Filecoin Plus helps it helps the network be in a situation where it's more profitable to store data rather than just commit capacity. But there's maybe a more important part, which is subsidizing Filecoin's entrance as a global storage provider in the global cloud, right? So it's like on the network level, if you're a storage provider, yes, you want to be able to, you want the preference to exist, but you also want a scenario in which storage providers are able to charge less for storage compared to other competitors. And at the moment, like, so let me put it this way. To some extent, right, which this hasn't fully been realized yet, but storage provider operations should be subsidized by being a miner. So if you're a miner, you have a couple, like if you're a miner on Filecoin and you're a storage provider, you have more revenue sources than just operating on a data center. You're a miner, which means that you can get tips from validating transactions. It also means that you can get block rewards. And those are all sources of revenue that a normal data center doesn't necessarily have. So those are also subsidizing data storage. The thing though is a quality multiplier or something like a data storage incentive provides an additional subsidy, and all of these allow you as a storage provider to offer storage at a cheaper rate. So that precursor were just to explain where this comes from, which is this is saying what is the deal income I need to, at a given quality multiplier amount, such that the profit for storing deals is greater than the profit for just committing capacity. If they're like, so Nicola, you look like you're confused.
No, please go ahead. I'm just digesting.
Okay, yeah. So I'll give you some more time to digest, but so we can stop here for a second, right? Because so this is saying that, this is, again, calculator-wise, like this is subject to a set of assumptions which you can play around with yourself. But the idea is at a certain token exchange rate and at a certain level of like deal income, this is saying that if the quality multiplier is, let's say, like, I don't know, 12, 14, you'd want to you would want to have to charge something around like $24 per TIB per year of storage, or something along those lines. That changes with exchange rate. That also actually, and that also changes with like the cost differential between CC and storing deals. But that's like the general idea. And it makes intuitive sense, which is like, you know, if the multiplier is low, you will have to charge more for storage. That totally, like, that aligns with our intuition. But I think it's good to like quantify this and understand to what degree that's the case, and like how that changes based on whatever set of assumptions we're under. Just to make sure we're on the same page, this is based on a projection of the networks given some amount of raw by power and QAP onboarding. So these are the minimum multipliers given network state. This isn't like hypothetical. So that, I think that maybe answers the first part of the question. The second is, like, theoretically though, you're right? Like if there's no capacity and there's just Filecoin Plus sectors, then then there's an equal amount of power for each sector type, and the rewards are dispersed that way. And to some extent, storage capacity makes the subsidy like more powerful, which is another reason why committing capacity has its own use as well. ZX.
Yeah, if this chart is from the current network state, then in some way we are in the regime that everything is Field Plus. Because if you look at all the onboarding, it's like almost 100% Field Plus on a daily basis.
Yeah. And the second part is that what you said is also kind of exchange rate sensitive, because like the earlier chart we're saying, like, you know, when you're in lower exchange rate regimes, you need a higher multiplier. That's another way of saying there's more incentive to take on the multiplier if you're in a lower exchange rate regime. That changes when you change what kind of like macroeconomic circumstance we're into. Yeah.
I can use the phone. Sarah, I just wanted to respond to that. As I was saying yesterday, and I'll make the case tomorrow, the amount of data that you don't want to be used should be like 10%. You don't need more headroom than that in a network. You want most of the storage to be valuable, useful data. So that, like, models where all of the data is Filecoin Plus is what we designed for.
I want to respond to Jonathan saying is like, in this track, in the protocol track, what I want us to maybe align, as like protocol designers with like storage provider network participants is like whether the network protocol should have a preference for data storage. Because like you said, in the first year, Filecoin Plus was amazing, right? It gave the incentive for people to spend extra, cost to building the software so that people can use Filecoin network. That is why we introduced this like extra rewards for people that are storing the data in the network rather than just committing capacity, which again, CC are very important for network security. So I'm not saying that's not important. But however, what I want to get aligned on is like whether we should have a preference for data storage. My biggest concern of some of the proposal out there right now is that let's just like remove Filecoin Plus as a principle from the protocol, is that we don't think we as a network is ready to have that utility.
Sorry, Trevor. I don't think that we're trying. I don't know if this is on. I don't think we're trying to debate. Do we want? Sorry, apologies. I don't think we're trying to debate. Do we want Filecoin to be about storing data or not? Like that was a thing that we all agreed to on that first slide from Vic. Like we want Filecoin to be about storing data. That's why it exists as a decentralized storage market. So we're not going to decide as a set of protocol designers, like, hey, we're going to throw the mission of Filecoin out the door and like make Filecoin about puppies and rainbows or something. I don't think we're asking that question today. I think what we're asking is, how do we achieve that effectively in protocol design? And where are we falling short from achieving that vision? And the challenges folks are describing around, hey, right now there's a dominant abuse strategy that the incentives are actually pushing towards in Full Plus, which is a huge problem that we need to make sure our incentives do not reward abuse so that the value is recurred by the people who do data storage. And really that's useful data storage is not, any one party has a monopoly on like, I consider scientific data valuable and therefore only scientific data should exist on Filecoin. No, it's the union, as Juan was saying yesterday, of all real data. It's trying to avoid the like self-dealing zero, I'm faking data storage that's not real. And it's making sure the incentive goes towards any one of the union that is actually truly real data in the system. But we need to make sure that we fight abuse and that the rewards that are being there to subsidize actually having Filecoin achieve its vision go in the right direction. Then that don't go and get diluted by abusers who are trying to attack the network. And so I think that's at least how I'd be framing it.
Yeah, and a short plug for, I'm going to give a talk tomorrow about that component. It's like as I was saying yesterday, Filecoin fundamentally needs a way of routing the incentive, the block reward, to useful data. Given that, what are the ways of doing it? There's no mathematical or cryptographic way of doing it. So we need a collection of systems that can approximate it. The data cap model is a structure that lets you try different systems. And what we're finding is that the 3 or 4 systems that we have aren't sufficient or good enough. And so we need to both improve those and make new ones. So like that's what like most of the conversation should be about. Are we like aligned on that? Or raise your hand if you're like aligned on that. Or, all right, cool. All right, great.
I want to just try and articulate a dilemma that I think some SPs are sort of pointing to. It's sort of hard to define. Could you show the slide with the equations, the second slide with equations? One forward.
This one?
Yeah. So in the case that sort of Jonathan identified where we've sort of reached the success case of like dominant, Fill Plus deals represent most of the data. And then he was pointing out there is no incentive. So when we get to that case, M is just one in that case. There's no
That was functionally one short,
there's a very small, essentially nowhere to take the subsidy from. It's just the block rewards being distributed. And so in that case, we must have that, the storage revenue plus the block rewards exceeds the sector cost of deals, or there is a business that's default dead. And so when we get to that, so I think some people see that you've got to get to that point where the storage revenue exceeds the sector cost. With this block reward, there's this buffer that subsidizes it for a while and slowly decays. So in order to, but what the subsidy currently seems to do is disincentivize finding out how to earn that storage revenue. It's like this short-term, it's easier, better, rational to get Fill Plus rather than get someone to pay.
Yeah, really quickly, your question's an important one, but these set of equations don't necessarily answer it. The reason being, this is just saying what is the difference between a deal. Like this is saying we want there to be a preference to onboard data rather than to store CC. So in a network in which everyone is storing deals or everyone is Fill Plus, you can still onboard capacity, and so that M will have that same effect on dictating how much of a preference you have to onboard deals rather than just commit capacity. Does that make sense? Like, can I
think it's speaking to what I'm trying to point out, and I agree that it's hard to articulate. In that success case, we then need to get to a point where there are storage revenues. But in the meantime,
those are separate questions.
There's makes it hard to build those.
There's one where it's how much of an incentive is there to store data just on its own? The second question is, and that is more just a question of gross, raw revenue or raw profitability. And then there's another one which is compared to something else, how much more of a preference is there to store deals? So these could both be negative.
Vic, talking to the mic.
Okay,
Thanks.
yeah, thanks, sorry. These could both be negative, right? Sector profit for a deal and sector profit CC could both be negative, which is not a great world. But this is just telling you how much more of a preference in that world is it to onboard a deal rather than to just commit capacity. So there's and so that's what that M term still has the same effect regardless of what the state of the overall network looks like.
Yeah.
This is a super generative, amazing conversation. I also want to do a quick process check and pause. Vic put Everett into a slide and a set of narratives, and he hasn't gotten to present his piece. I wanted to check. Okay, I just wanted to say if we needed if you had other slides to talk to this, great. Then let's keep doing this. Thank you.
We should keep doing this, but does that kind of make sense as to the reason these equations are here isn't to answer your earlier question about what happens if everyone on the network is doing Fill Plus. It's more just to say irrespective of macro regime, how much more of a preference is there to be a deal storage provider rather than just commit capacity?
Sort of. It makes sense in the short term, but I think is ignoring the dilemma that it gets into.
It's not trying to answer that question. It's more just saying we have one condition, which is sector profit deals should be greater than sector profit CC. To how much extent is that true? And that's what we can quantify. But we can answer that question, but not with this.
But it's also incomplete, Alex. Just to your what this equation does not show is what you're trying to get at, which is on the default data, default alive question. It's the applications on the chain that introduce that subsidy. So who pays for the Bitcoin miners, for example? Who's funding the billions of dollars worth of use? No one's buying the hash rate anywhere. And so it's not a default dead business to mine Bitcoin. But that's because people are buying the Bitcoin on the other side because they want to use the network or hold it. In Bitcoin's case, it's holding it. In Ethereum's case, it's using it for applications. And if we can make using it for applications on Filecoin actually work, then it turns it into not a default dead business because the sector block rewards are coming from the use of the network. So it's not a these don't have to balance perfectly.
I get that the block rewards can stay non-zero forever.
Yeah. But beyond that is what you're saying, which is if you just isolate just the storage, the sector cost and the storage revenue do balance out and have to balance out into either storage, either a business that is default alive or default dead, just purely on the sale of that storage. However, that's not the full picture, because the full picture requires the gas burn and the use of the application for other things that funds the block reward. Like the block reward has to have an inflow on the other side, which is the utility of the network itself.
But I think Juan, I think what Alex was, sorry, this is loud again, but I think what Alex was saying was simply there's a feeling right now that by the fact that there is a subsidy currently, and it's a subsidy that is at current block reward multiplier level, which is a thing that is decaying in and of itself, that is holding back or not forcing people to make their storage revenue high enough to 100% compensate for sector cost. And I would say that's like, as much as I would absolutely love storage providers to be able to charge massive amounts of storage revenue to clients right now, that's partially because of the level of service that and reputation and durability that Filecoin has built up. You know, we didn't get started in 1990 like Salesforce did. We're still a relatively new network that's building our reputation and building our systems and our ease of client onboarding and our features that we offer. And so I think it's expected that right now storage providers wouldn't necessarily be able to charge in storage revenue to clients what they need to in order to 100% make up costs. And that M times sector block rewards is intending to help support storage providers do the deal-making process anyway and fill Filecoin full of real data and help it achieve its real mission, despite those not balancing yet. But I think we expect them to balance in the future and hopefully balance even more, because that means all storage providers who are doing deal-making are making an increasing profit over time and taking a larger margin as they build out their businesses and are able to sell it to more clients.
But it feels
But was I understanding your argument correctly? It was the balance of...
It's very close. It's not 100%, right? So block rewards can always make up some gaps. So the revenue doesn't need to 100% offset costs because block rewards can stay non-zeros, but they've got to offset most of the cost. Some fraction they've got to meet. And so I think the point, so in the near term, what you say makes a lot of sense. It's just that somehow there's a link missing between, currently the incentive is not to pursue revenue, because the current incentives, like number one incentive, try to scam Fill Plus. If you can't do that, number two incentive, try to legitimately do Fill Plus and like store some data for free, take whoever can give you the free data that can get the data cap, and not learn anything about providing a service that someone would actually pay for. When do we get to cross, I think SP is pointing out, when do we cross to like actually needing to provide a good service that's worth paying for? Nothing is incentivizing that right now, but this model assumes that we get there.
I think like another piece of this too, though, is like, especially when we think about the hardware on the network, there's like fiat liabilities that are being incurred. And so it's actually also important, to Alex's point, where like having a revenue source and having a paying customer is actually good for the net sustainability of the network. So we're not relying purely on like block rewards as the only funding source. And like in some senses, it almost would have been nicer if the way that we had been able to do, and we weren't able to do this at launch, is like if all deals by default were paid and they were all like USDC or something, and then Fill Plus deals actually were like a rebate to the client, where it's like, hey, you pay for doing this thing and then you get a cash back effectively in Fill. And so yeah, your net cost is maybe even negative and you're earning money by storing on the network. But like we're not necessarily saying like, hey, this is all just going to go funding hardware or whatever, and then et cetera.
Yeah, ultimately it depends like where in time you're looking at. So like you're going to have multiple cycles, and at the bottom of the cycles, who is not actually focusing on the revenue is just going to die. And just because of the nature of how like networks are architected, you're going to have like 70-80% of the people die because they were just super greedy and just wanting to get the block rewards. So even assuming that Fill Plus is 100% cheated, like for the next 2 years, what's going to happen is that at some point it's going to dilute everyone, and what's going to happen is that only the ones that are actually charging for storage are going to survive, and the rest is just going to drop.
Same if it's 100% legit, right? It could be 100% no scams at all, but it saturates. Same problem.
But then you are actually working on the quality of the service that you're providing, and you're getting like more of the revenue. So ultimately, if you just have like time going infinite, you're going to have people that charge for the storage be the only ones that can actually survive. And if you look at Bitcoin, like most of the miners die each cycle. It's a brutal business. And we are just going through the first cycle, I guess.
We should be doing, the network should be doing a lot of the front end of the business right now. Today, the front end, the original kind of goal set was that a lot of the front end of the business, which is talking to clients, selling the product, selling the service, figuring out how to onboard their data and so on, would be handled by parties in the network, but not necessarily all storage providers. It is a non-goal to force all storage providers to figure out how to be perfect in separate storage businesses. In that world, that's just kind of the world that we have today without Filecoin. That's just go and start a new centralized storage provider. We want to unbundle the role of creating a storage provider business into different roles so that parties can do as many of those roles as they want to and generate profits from, but you can build a sharing structure that ends up benefiting the whole network. So think of it closer to something like Uber or Airbnb or Didi or those kinds of services where you have the front end of the business run by a certain set of systems and the back end of the business run by another set of systems. But you don't want to force all the parties to do everything. And so the thing that can drive that is the utility of the network itself for an application layer. So really look at the Bitcoin or Ethereum cases and achieve those kinds of cases where the utilization of the network itself and the token itself is what's providing the additional revenue stream for all those parties that enables the data to come into the network and to then be useful to a lot of parties. So we should not be trying to solve for an environment where everybody has to do everything and then be profitable on their own. We want to enable the network to solve a bunch of those problems in a different slicing.
Another answer to Alex's question earlier, I think I don't think of it as you have too much subsidy, therefore you have no incentive to other stuff. Let's say if there's real demand that somebody really wants to pay, why would you say no to it, right? I think the challenge is there's no real demand, just we haven't figured out where that subset really is.
Sure, there's no incentive to find it.
No, but then sure, but let's say price keep on going down. At some point, everybody has strong incentive to find it too.
I mean, I would argue that there are already people, a number of groups, who offer good enough quality of service that they are charging and gaining storage revenues in addition to sector block rewards. So I would, by example, disprove that there aren't incentives for that. There are. You just have to offer a good enough service that there is demand from clients and they're willing to offer you a premium for the quality of service you're providing. And that quality of service, that demand from clients, looks like you're a reputable storage provider, you have good reputation, you offer retrievability on request so that you can, say, be a good backend to a CDN that's doing really fast retrievals, and you're storing data that a client is well incentivized to store with you because they care about it. And so that might be something like NFT storage. It's great, we've got all these NFTs, we want them to be stored well, we want this to be a good backend for future CDNs, and there's demand for this whole collection to be preserved well in perpetuity with storage providers. And so that's a decent example that does already exist, and there is already good demand between all these different aspects lining up to enable that storage.
I think the things I heard from this is they can offer very good quality, reputable, reliable storage service. But today, even they can offer that service, they can only offer that to the client who goes through this not too robust and efficient process, so that they can actually charge for verified data services, right? It's sure, I can give you a high retrievability and so on and so forth. However, you as a data client, you have to go through all these KYCs, waiting in the lines of the Filecoin Plus programs, or you have to be public data, your data have to be reviewed. There's a lot of cycles to go through before they can just like give the service out. I think that's the challenge that storage providers are facing right now.
One question that I have, which kind of builds off Juan's framing, which I think is helpful. Like, a good goal for the Filecoin network should be like a unified gateway into these decentralized data services, and like this lone wolf model where storage providers have to go out and do their own BD is maybe not ideal. But where do other data services fit into the subsidy? Because like presumably you run into the same problem with retrievability and compute over data and any other future service that you'd like to see under this unified front. So like how do you scale the program in a good way that's like predictable to fit those services? Or do we just say like there's a certain number of things that are like within that fold of Filecoin's unified front and everything else is like lone wolf model?
So some thoughts on that. This is one of those things where people have proposed the idea of using different multipliers for different types of data for a long time. I'm weakly against that. Not strongly against that, but I'm weakly against that. And the intuition there is that if the multiplier varies by the type of data, then you can get into some really warped situations where perfectly legitimate, valuable businesses are forced to change what they're doing out of macroeconomic changes outside of their environment, right? So for example, US interest rates go up or down. That changes whether or not a storage business is willing to store like scientific data that is like common public good or private enterprise data. Like those should not be linked that way. And so I'm weakly against different multipliers for different types of data because of that. Because when those macroeconomic environment changes happen, they'll impact the Filecoin economy. And when the Filecoin economy gets impacted, it'll change the exchange rate and it'll change the value of that multiplier. And so it'll force parties to choose one or the other. However, I'm not super strongly against it in that it could be a valuable way of directing the orientation of the net. Like I see the argument for it. I see the argument for tuning the multipliers for data that the network finds dramatically more valuable, right? If you have public data that can be computed on, that's licensed openly, that anybody can use, that is fundamentally more valuable to a community than private enterprise data that where you cannot do that. However, I would caution, like, my argument there would be take that step with a lot of caution and foresight because it's a tricky economic proposition to make.
Yeah, I think maybe I'm misarticulated. I'm not necessarily suggesting, or definitely not. I think that's a bad idea too. Instead of like rewarding different types of data, how do you decide what services around any data fit into that fold? So like right now, as far as I understand, retrievability isn't something that is receiving the subsidy, but I think it's part of the like Filecoin narrative in a way to provide useful storage is also to get it back, and then we introduce new narratives like compute over data as well, and it'd be nice to have that be like a unified sort of like front end for all of Filecoin where anyone can kind of like run a Lambda. So like how do you fit it's not necessarily per data type, but more per data service?
Yeah, I think so the Filecoin Plus original expectations were that the data was going to be retrievable. However, there's no good checking of that right now. There's some amount of checking with things like, I think there's Retrievable now. I think that there's some other systems, but that should just be checked fully. Retrievability, like this is more getting into retrieval questions, but my view is that the network should check retrievability the same way that we check the storage, meaning the entire data set of the Filecoin network should be checked for retrievability. Now, you don't want a super fast SLA or like high bandwidth SLA. That's not what the storage tier is for. And so you should kind of tune the parameters there to hit the right SLA. But that should be kind of like table stakes baseline expected from all the storage.
Who subsidizes the checking of the
Who subsidizes the checking of the proofs? Oh, you mean like who subsidizes the parties that are on the network outside pinging? Yeah. there are multiple designs for that kind of thing. You have to hang them onto the network. I don't want to hijack the conversation to talk about retrieval incentives, but come to the tracks talking about that.
Last one. So we all agree should be usable storage, and then we all agree that it should be 90%. We should just keep pushing for more usable storage. I think the key thing to kind of keep the community together is how do we iterate faster to kind of learn quicker, to move quicker, because it's been, it's been a fractious with the SPs. So, I think that's the key thing that we need to do going forward.
And I think that's Galen's would have some thoughts there.
Come tomorrow.
Yeah.
Where we'll
That's
discuss
what I was gonna say.
more. Yeah. I totally agree. There have been a lot of amazing things said, and I want to talk more about that tomorrow afternoon. I wanted to speak a little bit about some of the things that, Jonathan, you were asking about, like subsidies for other types of services. I think that one of the things that we have touched on, to Juan's point, is connecting retrievability to continued earning of the data cap currently. And so that is a way that those two are linked. And I think that it could absolutely be possible for people to make a proposal that says, if somebody was designing a different type of data service on this, like a data clearinghouse data DAO, that in itself should potentially be incentivized in some mechanism. Maybe that mechanism is a staking and a fee-based mechanism on fill, and it doesn't need a subsidy because it might not be connected to the volumetric amount. Or maybe it isn't. Maybe that data DAO takes some other mechanism and says, well, let's use data cap because we already have that. It's already an on-chain thing. Let's run it through that pathway and create a structure that says, this meta pathway of a verifier or a notary or some actor programmatic state that offers this service is going to also get incentivized by the network for offering that service in such a way that, so let's use data cap to do that. So then what are the protocol changes that we might need to make to how data cap is structured, how QAP is structured? Right now, data cap flows in a particular implementation way, right? It's made by root key holders, it goes to a verified actor, it goes to a client, it gets burned. What if, I don't know, there were other flow back mechanisms, right? Like data cap, once a deal expired, what if there was a different change? And if that deal successfully expires and makes it to completion, and it was a verified deal, is there some mechanism to have a locked collateral or a data cap kickback or a renewal to data cap? These are just throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks, right? These are not things that I am sitting here from a place of saying, I have researched all of these. The goal here is to say these are all different places where there is a need, there are implementation details for it, let's test it, which I think also goes to your point, Jonathan Hooker, of let's test and iterate faster. It worked really well for a time and we learned a lot. So what are the things that we need to test? If we all agree that right now abuse is a big threat, then what do we need to test in order to decrease the abuse? And I think we'll talk more about that. I know that we'll talk more about that tomorrow, but.
I was just going to add another plug for let's figure out how to iterate faster on that tomorrow. I had a question for you, Vic. The result of, hey, it's dominant to abuse is a huge problem. Do you have concrete suggestions yet for what might be possible mechanisms to, my view is that this is kind of you need an economic incentive to reduce abuse, and so slashing of some sort needs to exist for verified abuse. You get into two problems there. How do you actually legitimately verify that something is abuse? There are some versions of abuse that are really easy to check, the padding issue is super trivial to check. There are other issues that are way harder. So that's one set of questions. Separately, what is the right scale of an abuse deterrent there? Do we have any insight into what kind of scale of a fee you would require? Because my sense is that because this is dominant, but it doesn't seem to be extremely strongly dominant, and a small fee might actually go pretty far.
Yeah. So there are a lot of things there, but the first is this on? Okay. So one thing you mentioned before is we want to unbundle the responsibility of SPs to do a bunch of extra work, right? So an interesting thing is that unbundling process also changes what the dominant strategies are, because at the moment, if you're going to do Fill Plus and do it legitimately, you spend a lot of time sourcing BD, and a lot of things that would be outsourced that maybe isn't necessarily your cost. So there are a couple of things you want to do. One is you want to get the cost of being an abuser and the cost of being a legitimate actor as close as possible to one another. And then you want to ensure that, so when you bring the costs as close to one another, then there's no, you remove the need, or even like, why would you go about abusing when they're functionally the same? So there are two ways to do that. The first is to, number one is to like remove a lot of the extra costs that it takes to be a legitimate actor, like BD, sourcing, etc. The second is to slash, right? So it's like, if you are, and I think like to answer the first part is like how much you need to do that. You're right. It's probably not. It may not be that much. It may just be the way of exploiting like Filecoin. So this one right here is just like a couple of different like exploitation profiles. So the dominant strategy is to exploit Filecoin Plus, but it's not necessarily by that much because of the cost that you incur to do so. So if you have more value at risk for being a malicious actor through some kind of slashing penalty, then it all flips. So like, I think what I'm trying to say is there are a number of ways to make it more rational to be a data storage provider. The first is storage revenues. That changes the game entirely, because if you're abusing Phil Plus, you're likely not you're not receiving deal revenues because you're not doing it in good, like you're not actually a data storage provider. So that's one way. The second is on the cost side of the equation. So if you have a high slashing risk, if you don't pass retrievability checks or something along the lines that Galen was saying, then that makes it more costly. And the third is if you remove a lot of the extraneous costs that it takes to be a good actor, like BD, sourcing, et cetera. So all of these are like individual ways in which you can flip this. And so this is what I was going to say is this is like the protocol design track, right? Like this is Filecoin Plus is an interesting aspect of the Filecoin protocol because it is one that touches stuff external to like actual protocol design. I like this talk or this discussion was more about like what can we do at the protocol level to make Filecoin Plus Filecoin Plus better, and two, why do we need this incentive at the protocol level to exist? And then the second part is, okay, if we agree that we need it to exist at the protocol, but we also recognize that it touches parts outside of it, how do we make those parts better, and what are the things we need to do? What are the levers we need to pull? So I think there are a couple important ones. The first is like storage revenues, I think, when it comes to the abuse game. The second is these potential slashing costs and stuff, which I don't actually know if you'd be able to implement as part of protocol design. I think that'd have to be something that is part of like the notary data cap allocation process. Correct me if I'm wrong. But what?
Data cap as a thing, as a record on chain is still part of the protocol.
Yeah, I mean more like slashing for not passing retrievability checks or this like something along those lines. Like that would be a hard thing to introduce in like.
No, this is very close to consensus faults. So if you think about consensus faults, if you sign two different blocks in the same height, that is a consensus fault, and it faults your power, right? And so that faulting of the power carries a very small penalty in its own.
Sure.
The bigger penalty is losing the power and losing the rewards associated with that power. And so you can have something kind of like that here, where you, if that storage isn't retrievable, or that storage has abuse on a kind of like hard verifiable sort of way, then you fault the power, and then you don't get the additional rewards that come from having that power, because for the network that power isn't real.
So, but does that mean introducing also retrievability checks as part of the Filecoin protocol then too, which it's not, right?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah,
and that is like a pretty non-trivial
That's
problem.
what they another plug for the retrieval incentives track.
Yeah, no, there are many ways to address the Phil Plus problem. One is protocol design. The other is governance and community. Both should work together to try to achieve something. But it's important to understand like, number one, why we have the program in the first place, and also like maybe where are the areas where we get the biggest return for investing resources into trying to like address Phil Plus, like the Phil Plus problem.
And
the two biggest ones. Sorry.
Do you want?
Thanks. Sorry. So the two biggest ones, storage providers using VPNs, and so you got 5 storage providers around the world, but they're actually sitting in the same racks next to each other. That's one of the big ones, and also non-retrievable. Those two things, you would go 80% of the way to start cracking down.
Which is why I plugged proofs of location in yesterday. Yeah, we definitely should get strong proofs of location for the data. That's going to be a big requirement once we get into kind of like all kinds of certifications. There are many groups in the world that require data to be in specific geographic locations, and you need strong guarantees about that. And so proofs of location give you that. That gives you a more verifiable way of checking that the data is actually in that location, and so you can't pretend to be in a different location.
Yeah, I just want to push a little bit on the flip side, which is like I know right now kind of the LDN program, which is one of the 4 Phil Plus programs, kind of requires multiple different geographical distributions and retrievability in order for that to be kind of like qualifying storage. But I want to make the maybe counter proposal of there should be other programs inside Phil Plus that don't require that same set of, because what about all of our enterprise data that we don't want to have outside of which Germany or whatever country people are storing that data in, and have single geographic requirements, and shouldn't have to we should not have a horizontal all data that qualifies for all Phil Plus programs needs to abide by XYZ. And then we also have all of the USC Shoah data where it's look, this is people's personal genocide testimonial. It's super fucking private. They do not want to have that be something that's super accessible for anyone to be grabbing pieces of at all points in time and serving over the internet. And so there's going to be sub-programs within Phil Plus that don't necessarily abide by the current primitives or components of fast retrievability or geographic distribution. But I totally agree that those are pretty decent ones for the current Phil Plus program to continue cracking down on abuse for the standards that have been set there so far. I just want to make sure that we don't over-define Phil Plus as being those current primitives, because I do want there to be private enterprise data and all sorts of other things that fits within the union of all useful data that should be stored.
Yes, we have Enterprise Phil Plus, and also I think a thing that we want to decouple is a VPN is a particular type of indicator of a behavior, but I don't want it to be the only proof in a certain direction that if you are using a VPN, therefore it must be you're cheating or it's abuse or you're spoofing. I think that switching from the concept of VPN to the concept of proof of location would be great. And so being able to say, we are not looking at it from are you using a VPN? Yes, no. But we are looking at it from a programmatically and protocol level. We can offer a proof of location option. You could choose to go that path. If you don't choose to go that path, maybe you are not going to be able to do certain types of data cap pathways, because certain data cap pathways will require proof of distribution for proof of location. I think one other thing, as a tangent, that we've been curious about from the governance team, taking this to the room that is here, is the concept of multi-sigs of multi-sigs. This has been a hurdle that we have faced from a technological and chain implementation layer, from kind of decentralization and SEC components, being able to create an LDN type pathway where we can say it's going to need a couple of different checks, and then it's going to need some human in the loop to give a final pass. And what we would like is for this multi-sig to be able to have some human in the loops that could get it, but they couldn't run away with it. And if one of those addresses needs to change, it would be easy to do. And being able to structure these things that are nested multi-sigs of multi-sigs, I think could add a lot of interesting value. And so far we have been technologically blocked. I would be curious to hear from the brain trust in this room as to what is the capacity for that? What are the blind spots that we're seeing in having a structure like that would allow a multi-sig actor with nested multi-sigs inside of it? And I think maybe CryptoNet, Nicola, if you could speak to that, it might be within your wheelhouse specifically.
I don't think it's like specifically what we do, but there is one thing that a lot of DAOs kind of moved into this direction. It's like too much effort for a DAO to look into too many. Some projects are too big, and what they do, they have this DAO that gives money to these sub guilds, DAOs, or sub-organizations. I don't know how you want to call them. And I think this is a great model. Yeah, I think Uniswap has recently moved some of their grants giving in this way. And I think in the same way, I see Filecoin as a DAO and made of notaries and it's not like an on-chain DAO necessarily, but there is power to organize ourselves to have many small experiments that we can keep on funding, not with money, but with data cap. And we should give freedom to these people to give an experiment with data cap. I wouldn't do it all of it. I would do it with small amount and see if it works, and then we keep on giving that.
Maybe like question, Alex, please like correct me if I'm wrong. Like from the protocol level in the built-in expert, there's nothing to stop you to add a multi-sig as one of the center of a multi-sig. Like I just quickly.
That's what they have right now, and they don't like it.
No, they're saying they cannot do it. Technology. They say. Wait, sorry, Galen, can you confirm? It's like, your question is about like if I can have a multi-sig of a multi-sig, right? Okay, yeah, I think you can, yeah.
Just follow up on the retrieval question. The network should verify that the data can be retrieved by the parties authorized to do so. So there are some deals where the clients do not want that data to be retrievable by anybody in the world. They want to only authorize a specific set of parties to do so. And that's not plain text data. They don't want the ciphertext to be retrieved. And that's okay. We do need to check that the data is retrievable for the authorized parties. Otherwise, then it's like a black hole storage, right? You put the data in, but you can't get it out. So we need to verify that the data is indeed retrievable. And today, the way that that's happening in the examples that you mentioned is that there are separate agreements drafted out in paper with like DocuSign signatures in order to certify that retrievability will happen. And they have no good guarantees on it other than that piece of paper and whatever recourse that piece of paper would give you. We want the network to do that on-chain, on smart contracts, and that's where the retrievability guarantees need to come from. But that can be just for the checking and with good access controls that only the parties that are authorized by the clients can do so.
I guess if the network is made up of a decentralized set of nodes that are untrusted, point A, we have 3,300 storage providers right now. Saturn has 3,000 POPs. Like they're untrusted nodes that could be anyone. So if the network itself is made of untrusted parties, then if you are going to delegate to the network to do that checking on your behalf, who are you going to choose to trust within that network?
This is a good problem we can solve with cryptography. You could actually submit the pre-image, you can submit a piece that is supposed to be the ciphertext, encoded in some way that is not that you can't where you can't go back to the original decoding, and you can transfer that. So you can end up in a good situation where you get some cryptographic freshness, you use that to derive some encoding, and so you can do retrievability checks on ciphertexts without actually getting the ciphertext that is in question. So
Okay.
that's a solvable problem.
All right, sounds good.
Yeah.
I think we're at time, but this isn't the end of Phil Plus. Tomorrow we'll have more. So I don't know where that will be, but Galen will be doing some more.
Plug to move all of the spicy questions about Phil Plus to my talk tomorrow about the kind of like why we need the subsidy in general.